Hello, everyone. Oh, I'm going to have to say next slide, please, aren't I?
Yeah.
Right. So, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. How's everyone's festival been this year? Can I get a woo? That's the most fun you're going to have for this entire talk. We've heard about networking, AI tools, public speaking, being a multidisciplinary technologist. We've talked about tech for good. We've talked about swearing. We've talked about accessibility. We've just had a phenomenal talk about asynchronous code. And now it's time to talk about documentation. Yay! Right, so who am I? My name is Leo Riviera. I work as a software engineer by day, an evil genius by night. In my day job, what I do is I help build tools or financial tools to help bad people, to stop bad people, to stop bad people, namely criminals, from doing bad things, namely complex financial crime. That's why I need to refer to my notes religiously. I work at my own consultancy company, Voxer. I work as the innovation and outreach lead there, and that allows me to travel and do talks and say hello to cool people like you all. And as you may be able to tell, I'm also incredibly handsome. Please do call me. I do this quite a bit. That's a picture of me presenting a talk, It just keeps going forever. The whole, if there's any photographers about, please. But yeah, the shirt, I did not have the shirt this year, but hey ho. Oh, hello. This is so stupid. Right. So what's this about? So before we continue, can I have a show of hands? Who here has written documentation? Okay. Okay, good. Who here has written good documentation? Lovely. Everyone who has their hand up is a liar. The aim of this talk isn't to answer all your questions about documentation, but it's to provide you with a holistic overview. It's to provide you with a mental framework that you can use to think about documentation. So to do this, we'll ask 6 questions, the first of which is what? What is documentation? And more importantly, what it's not. We'll talk about why we write documentation in the first place and its importance in good software engineering. We'll talk about who consumes the documentation that we write and how we can consider them when we write this documentation. We'll talk about the software development lifecycle, and how documentation filters into it. This is really dry. And we're going to talk about where this documentation should live. And finally, we're going to talk about how we write documentation. I do only have 25 minutes, so I'll be discussing this in the context of a product-led software as a service organization, but the principles that I raised today are broadly applicable to small hobbyist projects, to open source projects, to command line utilities, and of course to consultancy projects for clients. It's broadly applicable to almost all software. So we come to our first question. What exactly is documentation? Well, documentation is persistent communication that explains the software that you write. That's all it is. Any sort of software, from a command line utility, to some of the biggest distributed systems with 4,000 microservices, they all need documentation because they need to explain their functionality, their usage, their specifics about distribution and deployment, and of course, any maintenance procedures. And documentation also, back a slide. Sorry, documentation also helps people who deal with your system understand the overall system, its purpose, the components that make it fit together, and so on and so forth. Now, that being said, there are several types of documentation which exist. There we go. The first type of documentation on our far. Do you want to do? No, go back. Do you want to do like the little laser pointer? Yeah, laser pointer. Fuck yeah. So the type of documentation on our left here, thank you very much, is requirements documentation. So that covers the... I give up, man. You come to my house and try to blind me on the day of my daughter's wedding. No, okay, that's brilliant. I'm glad somebody got that. Right. So this captures the functional and the non-functional requirements of the software. So when we talk about the functional requirements, what exactly does a piece of software need to accomplish for users to be happy with it? So what inputs do we take? How do we process them? How do we output them? How do we store them? Those are all functional requirements. But requirements documentation also covers our non-functional components. So these are things that the users can't see, but directly affect the system. So things like response times, how the system scales, its security, its usability, and of course, where's Doro? It's accessibility, yeah. Next, technical documentation. That's for engineers who are implementing the system. And that discusses the architecture, the design decisions, the code base, the APIs, and the external integrations, all the technical bits and bobs that you all love so much. And then finally, towards the end of software development, we produce the end user documentation. And these are mostly the guides, the manuals, the instructional videos, so that customers can learn the software, and obviously not without too much technical jargon. So to fulfill its goal, also close, to fulfill its goal, good documentation needs to have a number of characteristics. Next slide, please. So what is documentation? Documentation needs to be simple, it needs to be structured, informative, meticulous, participative, legible, and easily accessible. I have talking points for all of these, and I was supposed to reveal them one by one, but sod it, let's go. So structured, it needs to be structured. It needs to be structured in a logical and a coherent manner that makes sense, so it's easy to navigate and reference. It needs to be informative. It actually needs to tell users things, and it's not a replacement for communicating within your team. You still need to speak to people, as we'll discuss later. Yeah, me too, me too. Yeah, we are all going to die one day. It needs to be meticulous. It needs to be comprehensive. It needs to cover topics as your. It needs to cover topics, features, and functionalities in some reasonable depth, so your user actually leaves with an idea of what your system does. It's not static. It's not unchanging. It grows and develops with your project. It needs to be participative. It needs to be collaborative. It needs to be collecting contributions, feedback, and update from people who actually use the documentation and interact with your system. So that it remains accurate and relevant. It needs to be legible, clear, consistent, concise, easy to read. And of course, it needs to be easily accessible. Nobody's going to read documentation if it's buried in that box with the other stuff that you have under your cupboard. It needs to be easily accessible by the people who actually use it. You have a look of confusion in your face, Kim. Oh yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, so we get what documentation is. We need to understand why we write it. We've built a cool hobby project. We've made a cool feature or anything like that. Why do we actually bother documenting it? Well, the purpose of documentation is to communicate, to preserve, and to guide. Next slide, please. I put way too much work into that. So we communicate. We communicate the information about our code, and we do that because all the people who are involved in the software engineering process need to communicate with one another, but the process is often asynchronous. You'll have your customer who will be in the room with you at one point in time telling you what they want, then you have to go off and code it. We'll have one engineer work on one piece of software or one portion of your software at one point in time, and then you'll have another engineer come along and fuck things up. So basically, well-written documentation allows you to communicate between different groups of people at different points in time. The next, oh, look at that, is to preserve. I'm so sorry. I've spent way too much time on these. The next function of documentation is to preserve. It preserves information. As we work on a project, things may go wrong. We may need to make changes, and we need to document those decisions to make sure that the people in the future will ask or will understand what we've done now and the decisions we've had to make. But in addition to that, in some businesses, it's a legal and it's a regulatory requirement to document how decisions are made and so on and so forth. Also, when you all eventually get jobs, documentation is going to help you understand how the system works. It's going to help you get on board, and it's obviously going to help you start contributing. And documentation is important for business continuity because if things burn or if a meteor hits your data center or something, you need to understand, okay, this is our infrastructure and this is the implementation upon that infrastructure. Ah, do it, yeah! God, I'm so sorry. It's been long, man. Anyways, the last purpose of documentation is to guide. It's to provide the people who are in our project with context so that they can actually make good decisions and not screw everything up. And it provides context around the system's limitations, requirements, and it helps guide business leaders when making decisions, for example. So who actually uses the documentation that we write? Who are we writing this for? Who's actually consuming this communication? Well, our product stakeholders are the ones who most often use its documentations. And they're called stakeholders because they hold a stake in the project's success. It's so stupid. But they hold a stake in the project's success. They're either affected by or they affect the outcome of your project. So who uses documentation? Well, for the purposes of this talk, we'll have a bunch of common stakeholders that include customers who have product level visibility. They can see everything that your product does, and they don't really care about the individual features or how they're implemented. They just know that if I buy your piece of software, it will help me achieve this business goal, sell more stuff, send more emails, or whatever it is. Right? The next are product managers. They understand the features which come together to actually make the product. And so they have a degree of feature level visibility. They know the ins and the outs of the software. Following that, we have software architects. They think about the bigger picture abstractions. They understand the bits and pieces which make the features work. And so because of that, they know the workflows, the actions, the processes. They have process level visibility into your software. And finally, we have us, the software engineers who implement the code, who actually do the really hard work of solving customer problems, and they have implementation level visibility because they know how features are implemented. Now, other types of stakeholder do exist, but we'll just talk about these four for now. So when it comes to using documentation, everyone uses it slightly differently. First off, we have users, as we've mentioned, and they're responsible for press the button. They're responsible for that will never get old. They're responsible for obviously understanding our product. And so what we do is we give them documentation, the end user documentation, so they can look at our product and say, oh, that's nice. I'd like to spend lots of money on that. And then they give us money. And then what they do is they take that and they use that to achieve some business outcome and create some degree of value. They want to know how the product works. And so they use the end user documentation to troubleshoot the issues, to customize and configure their software, to train their staff, to integrate with other systems and all of that. Next, we have product managers. Now, product managers, they speak to the customers, they produce requirements documentation, and they decide new features. After that, we have software architects who take the technical, or who take the requirements documentation alongside the product managers, and they say, okay, we need to break this particular feature down into different processes that our software engineers can go off and implement. So how are we going to design that? How does this new feature fit into the rest of the system? And of course, they also use technical documentation to understand that. And finally, software engineers. We build the system. I don't get enough credit for this. But what they do is they use the technical documentation. They understand how each of the processes are implemented. And of course, they know what to touch when doing their work. So when do we write documentation? This is my favorite slide. No, the next one's my favorite slide. That's beside the point. So we produce documentation throughout the software development lifecycle from inception to delivery. Now, what exactly do I mean by software development lifecycle? What do I mean by SDLC? Well, it's this circle. Look at it. Around and around and around we go until the end of time. Sorry, that's not in my notes. So requirements analysis, the very first stage up here. Laser pointer, please. Thank you so much. Yeah, there you go. Requirements analysis. What we do is we take the functional and non-functional requirements I mentioned earlier. We document our requirements. We define our scope. We effectively say, what does success look like? If this thing is to be good, or if I want to get a thumbs up from my customer, what exactly do I need to do? Next, we have design, where we actually take success, or idea of success, and we talk about how it goes into our system. So we produce system design documents. They describe in greater detail the technical changes that need to be made, and we may document structure and relationships within our database and stuff like that. During development and implementation, we write the code, and of course, we include comments and source code, but we also write technical documentation to make sure we write and adjust technical documentation to make sure that we understand the changes that are made to our code. During testing, what we do is we write test plans to document the approach and the scope. What we do is we make sure that the software meets the specified requirements, but we also document the way that we test. So if we do break the system, engineers can go back, reproduce it, and fix it. And last but not least, we have deployment and maintenance. So with this, what we do is we figure out how to put stuff into production, and we also tell users how they can use it. Now, this is a cycle. This is a circle. How many of you all are familiar with Agile? Just stick your hand up. Lovely. You all are cursed with forbidden knowledge. Your documentation will evolve with your project as it goes through this software development lifecycle. And of course, this is an iterative process. You will always be analyzing your requirements and designing new things and then developing and then testing and then deploying, and then your customer will complain. And so you create some more requirements, and then you design, and then you develop, and then you test, and then you deploy, and it goes around and around and around as you add new features to your system. So we write all the documentation, it looks good, we understand why we do it, so on and so forth, we know who consumes it. where does it live? So the worst thing is, in most organizations, documentation lives inside people's heads. And the problem is, you've got someone who's really smart on your team, and they've written 90% of the software, and you know what they're doing, or they know what they're doing, but you don't, and you cannot crack their skull open to figure out exactly what's in there. The only thing that's really stopping me are the laws of England and Wales. So if you know somewhere that's legal, let me know. There are bits of information that should get shared between teams, but they don't. And for whatever reason, people go on holiday, people get sick, people leave, people unfortunately die. And they forget they know what they know, and this is called a knowledge silo. So where does documentation live? Knowledge being locked inside people's heads actually does affect the way that people work. Every year, Stack Overflow has a survey, and the 2023 survey, 77% of professional developers said they weren't confident they could find information within their organization to help them do their job. 71% said they encountered knowledge silos at work, and then 53% said that waiting on answers from other people, the knowledge trapped inside other people's heads, caused interruptions to their work. And 45% stated knowledge silos stopped them from getting their ideas across an organization. The fact that we don't write things down actually affects the way that people work. So the question isn't where does documentation live, but it's where should documentation live? Oh, that was clean. I'm so happy with that. It's so good. It's so good. This took me countless hours. Hours I'll never get back. Where should documentation live? Next slide, please. Documentation should live wherever the team works. So obviously this differs from organization to organization, but let's think and let's sort of consider a few ideas. The first one is in the code or in the same repository. So JSDoc and GoDoc, for example, what they can do is they can perform static analysis of your code. They can scrape out all those comments when written in a particular format, and they can put them in a nice, pretty HTML page, and you can click around and you can figure out how it works. You also may have it in a README or in an interactive workbook, for example. You also have a central repository, and this is a central repository of documentation when your documentation sort of touches various components of your code. So an open API repository, for example, which tells you the endpoints in a project. You also have wikis, such as Confluence and Living Spec, and what they do is they have features specifically enabled to sort of help with technical team collaboration. They have things for process level documentation, so how things move within your system, how data is processed, and how data is output and stored, and so on and so forth. And that's very, very helpful. And some companies also produce PDFs and videos and other easily shareable media that lives in help centers, so customers can understand what or how your product works. Now, obviously, there's no concrete answer to where should your documentation live. You probably are doing a hobby project of some sort, or working in a large organization or whatever it is. And so I can't stand up here and concretely answer this question, but there are a few things that we can consider. The first thing is the type of documentation we're writing. Of course, if we're writing or the different types of documentation we produce, the three types we mentioned earlier, the requirements, the technical, and the end user, they're best off in different places. So for example, requirements documentation, it may be best in an internal wiki where other people can look at it and comment on it. Technical specifications may be best in the version controlled repository, so you can look and understand that this particular version at this point in time was or had this particular schema. And end user documentation is, of course, best access from a product's website. You can consider why you're actually writing the documentation, the point of it in the first place. So, of course, if you're proposing features, that's probably best in an internal forum. If you're discussing internal pipelines, that's also probably best in an internal forum. If you're speaking to customers, you may want to put it on a website or on a password protected area. And of course, if you're trying to guide end users, go where they will look, go in help centers, or put your documentation in help centers, where they'll inevitably look for advice and assistance. Consider your audience, I think, is another important one. Make it accessible for who you'd like to read it. Ask yourself who's reading it, ask yourself where they're getting their information from. Consider where you're at in the SDLC that we just mentioned. Early in software development, as you're proposing the features and as you're slowly designing them, you'll want more people to access it. And then as you go along, you'll want fewer and fewer people to sort of access that internal documentation, because the number of people who are working on it are inevitably smaller. Next one is store similar documentation together. So grouping similar documentation together makes things a lot easier to find, as the consumers don't need to go searching. There's no point having 3 different help desks or 3 different internal wiki sites or 3 different repositories which are all central. Store things in one place so that the consumers of your documentation don't doubt themselves, and they know that this is the latest, this is where things live, this is how things work. And of course, Next one, please. Yeah, ask someone where you'll work because they'll have an idea, right? I know this is hard and talking to people is scary and they're mean to you and also they say mean things and they shout at you sometimes, but ask people where you work because, thank you very much, Lisa. Ask people where you work because they'll often give you guidance historically on where documentation is stored. So how do we write documentation? Well, I have no fucking clue. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be off. No, so God, it's so hard. There's no single formula for producing good documentation. So the key thing is good documentation is written in context. However, I have a list of bullet points, which will not be clicked through correctly, that will help you with, how to, I'm so sorry. Thank you so much for agreeing to help me, by the way, because it's a massive help. I only have 2 hands. But, a list of bullet points that will help you write documentation. Think about how you'd like your documentation to be consumed. This is a really interesting one. If it's a how-to guide, for example, then the amount of documentation should be reasonable for someone to skim through. Let's say you've got let's say starting your service is a 7-step process. Your developer, whoever it is, knows steps 1 through 5. They want to easily skim through your documentation to sort of understand the process and get an overview of it before diving into it. In the case of a reference, it's reasonable to go into as much detail as possible, mostly because you want to give them a central resource to look at, and you can keep it navigable by using headers and summaries and such. Regardless of the structure of your documentation, it shouldn't be a thesis. Dense text breaks people's brains. Make it easy to read through by using line breaks, by using bold text. Keep your tone of voice consistent and keep your language clear. Don't hide behind big, overly complex words such as anti-disestablishmentarianism. Break down difficult concepts so users can actually come away with some degree of understanding of what you've written. Think about your underlying assumptions when it comes to your reader. What exactly do you think that your reader knows? Is there something worth explaining completely or from first principles? If so, it may be useful to include in your documentation. Some additional points. It may be useful to view your product as a collection of features, and then those features are powered by code, and that's code that you write. And so because of that, what you may want to do is when you're documenting for internal purposes for other people within your organization, you may want to consider how different parts of your system work together, document any dependencies, and obviously document any constraints that those services face. When you're documenting for external consumption, you may want to consider your project as a black box or a brick in a wall that the user is building because they want to use your software for some purpose. And so because of that, you want to document the inputs and the outputs. You may want to talk about how it processes and stores information and how it works together with other software. Communicate in a way that's useful to your customer. Videos for to the consumer of the documentation, forgive me. Videos for customers, diagrams for software architects, text for engineers, so they can easily search through Control F for key terms. And keep your documentation relevant by discussing what it does and not necessarily how it does it. Now, this is sort of a general point. It is a little bit contentious because, of course, the point of documentation is what does your system do, but also what are some of the pitfalls of your implementation. But the most important thing is if you avoid exposing information about your internal implementation, then you keep your document relevant for longer. And of course, it's important to strike a balance between how useful something is and how relevant something is. So in conclusion, documentation is persistent communication that explains the software that you write. The purpose of documentation is to communicate, to preserve, and to guide. A product's stakeholders are the ones who most often use its documentation. We produce documentation throughout the software development lifecycle from inception to delivery. Documentation is best written in context. And of course, documentation should live wherever the team works.